You're listening to Ecosysteming, the podcast redefining economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship, 2 decades in the making. Join NC Idea's Tom Rue as he engages with entrepreneurs and experts who are challenging the status quo and driving lasting change.
On today's episode of the Ecosysteming podcast, I am happy to be joined by Lauren McCullough. Lauren, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom.
I tell you what, you and I know each other, and that'll become evident very soon. But for the listeners, why don't you give a brief biographical background on yourself, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. I was born. No, I'm just kidding. I'm from Ohio originally. Grew up there. I ended up going to Ohio University to go to school, which is kind of where I got, I guess, thrown somewhat into this world of entrepreneurship. It happened, at least as I recall, into my lack of patience with bureaucracy. I had done some government work and some nonprofit work, and found out that I'm not very good at waiting on the processes that those type of industries often entail. And so someone had told me, hey, you might like entrepreneurship. That might be something that's good for you. And so I had done some work in graduate school there. I had then ended up working in a business incubator. And that was really where I kind of fallen into this love for economic development and really seeing entrepreneurship as a path to how economic development can really be sustained in these communities that maybe are looking for new opportunities for people of all different shapes, sizes, and colors and backgrounds. And then that brought me down to North Carolina, really, because I was looking for that more vibrant tech scene and really liked it down here, really liked the culture of North Carolina. And after working with a startup, I was introduced to NC Idea through a job application. And I really had missed that working with founders type of experience. And after, Thomas, was shortly after you started NC Idea. And so I joined there, and I'm sure we'll get into more details of that. Running the Sea Grant program, running many different programs until I was ready to take the leap and do it on my own. And then more recently have jumped into being the founder and CEO of Trommel, which is a business intelligence platform that's focused on automatically extracting actionable insights for e-commerce sellers, particularly in the auto parts industry, and allowing them to turn that into information that they can use to make more data-driven decisions.
Now, hold on, before we get too far down the road, let me make sure I'm clear on something. Did you say you're from the state of Ohio originally?
Ohio, yes. 4 letters, you can make it in symbols with your body and a bunch of people playing the drums. Yeah, that one.
I've heard that many of the really big minds in entrepreneurship and economic development come from Ohio, that great Midwestern state that's on the north coast of our wonderful country. So good for you. Yeah, I think you're in good company.
Yeah, Ohio's greatest export is definitely good people. I do think that, when you get south of 70, though, things start to get a little bit better.
Let's let the listeners in on the inside joke. I am also from Ohio, although I am distant from our southern cousins from the boroughs that Lauren comes from. I'm up on the north coast of Northeast Ohio. So, and there's actually a lot of us in North Carolina. Someone once told me at a conference there were close to 200,000 people from Ohio now calling North Carolina home. So,
oh, that's wild.
Yeah. So, all right, let's talk about you. You mentioned NC Idea. You spent a little time with us. I know this is kind of a patented, a bit of a fluffy, puffy question, but what do you think you took away from the time we were together?
Yeah. Ooh, what did I take away from NC Idea? I mean, it's so interesting because, when you're working professional, those times, and for me, it was like my late 20s, I think are the most formative years of your career, because that's where you've got a little bit of background. You started to know how the world works, but you don't necessarily, in most cases, have your trajectory yet. And that was exactly the era, that I was at NC Idea. And I think for me, it walked from a tactical standpoint, right, as a founder now, it basically gave me, a couple thousand case studies into what works and what doesn't. Um, it gave me so much exposure to just the repetition of what it takes to do this like very what is also often a very ambiguous journey, right? Because like there's not no the reason you're successful, especially in the technology industry as a startup, is because no one's ever done it before. So the nature of it is that there's no playbook, but you can still, I think, learn from case studies. And then I think to me too, what I really learned, particularly during the last couple of years I was there, is how important it is that this is used, as I mentioned earlier, as an opportunity for creating opportunity, right? Like to actually use entrepreneurship to not only make sure that these towns that we felt like were left behind in the more rural areas, and the people that are maybe left behind in our own communities can leverage the benefits of entrepreneurship and an entrepreneur mindset, right? As I'm sure we'll kind of talk about to reshape their destiny.
So you would be safe to say you'd be a proponent for using entrepreneurship as an economic development practice.
Maybe a little bit, maybe just a
Yeah.
little bit.
Well, I mean, again, we're being a little cheeky in this regard, but I think it's because we both share the understanding from personal experience level, right? I mean, I know in my own case, it was entrepreneurship that really created a foundation of financial stability for my family, and it was on that process, on that spectrum, and also kind of life stage, right? It was 40 when I exited my last company and kind of looked around and said, hey, this entrepreneurship did a lot for our family. It could probably do a lot for others. So why don't we get into, whether it was philanthropic led or however it gets structured. And, based upon that understanding, how would you evaluate the ecosystem that we have? I mean, everybody that knows North Carolina understands that the entire state is not equally endowed with entrepreneurship support. So if you want to comment, on a local level or statewide, that's up to you. But what would you say about the ecosystem in North Carolina?
Yeah. So while you were asking that, what popped into my head is, and I feel like this is maybe it's biased. This is my journey, right? Is like you see those people in high school, right? That they're so bright and they have so much potential, but they're still just like an A B student. Like they're not making like any of these giant academic awards. Like they're not going to go to an Ivy League, but you see something in them that just needs to continue to be fostered to be great. And that's how I see this ecosystem is when you look at us on a map, in certain ways we're thriving, right? In certain subjects we're thriving. Others we have a whole lot of work to do. But I think that we have this promise and potential to be the best, and I'll use this as a statewide, but I also I'm a big proponent for the triangle. We have the opportunity to be the best entrepreneur community in the globe. And I believe that because I don't actually think the Silicon Valley method is correct. Like I think that these controversial, right? I think that we have now recognized that there is a bit of a flawed model in this excessive amounts of funding and injecting like just insane amounts of capital with no eye on profitability. And I mean, we can be grateful, right? It gave us the ability to do ride shares, and it's given us like all this great technology that we use today. But many of those companies are still not profitable, right? Decades later. And I think that there's this new wave of ecosystems that create opportunity with sustainability in mind. And I feel like we have the ability to be this perfect Goldilocks zone of that in the state.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'll tell you how I'm interpreting what you're saying is that maybe the Silicon Valley model, is still that mythical model, that unicorn that, yes, through consequence of historical things happening, made it what it is, but that our approach is more practical. Would practical be a good way to describe that? Like being profitable as soon as possible is like important for us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sustainable maybe too, right? Practical, but I think sustainable is really how I think about it. You bring up unicorns, and I always think it's funny when we talk about this hunt for unicorns for VCs, where the joke of it is right, is a unicorn's a myth. It's not that there's only a few unicorns. Like unicorns aren't a thing, in a practical sense of the animal world, right? But what is real is Like I think that there's a organization that used to be around. I'm not sure if they still work, called the Zebras Unite, and the whole concept was like zebras are real, right? They're black and white, red all over, and they exist in these communities, and they're these really important parts of, in that case, right, an animal ecosystem. And I think that that's really what we have the ability to create is things that are real here, but still highly scalable, right? Because I think sometimes when you start talking about profitability in startups, people think, oh, we're talking Main Street businesses. Oh, we're talking like companies that cap out at a 50, $100 billion or $1 million valuation, and that's not true. Like you can still build $1 billion company with sustainability in mind.
So, Lauren, one of the things you said in your critique of Silicon Valley was that there's a lot of money, being thrown at very nascent ideas for a long time, and it kind of creates a distortion, if you will. So, is that to imply or infer that you think the capital stack in North Carolina is adequate?
Yeah, I think the capital stack in North Carolina is getting better, but I would not call it adequate yet. And it's certainly not at the point where it's going to allow us to thrive and I think reach our best potential. And particularly, I still hold that, throwing $5 million at a pitch deck in 99.999 long nine cents cases does not make sense, right? But injecting $500,000 into some really amazing ideas when you've got founder market fit, probably worthwhile investment. And then if you invest strategically, you double down. But that doubling down has to be sustainable and not just a basically training founders to raise for the next raise. It actually hurts, I think, a lot to do that. And so I think there's this ability for us to have a grounded leverage what works about it, right? Like we've shown in Silicon Valley, like investing in ideas with some sufficient capital works. But again, I'm a big proponent of invest in iterations and double down, and push founders. And I would even hold this myself accountable. There's like push founders continue to show growth. Sometimes that growth is, in revenue. Sometimes that growth is in learnings and lessons. But without access to the amount of capital, like you're handcuffed. Like it does take money to build things. It's getting cheaper in certain situations, but it still does require capital, or else we're just changing the trajectory of ourselves into one that's like very hard to inflect from.
So you're suggesting that we could use more capital, especially in the earlier stage of the funding. But it's not just the dollars itself; it's the leadership of these funds, right? And a critique I have heard from, we are now over 600 funded companies, Trammell being one of them. One of the criticism, and I want to check my own assumptions here to see if it's fair or not, is that we hear, the funds here are polite. They don't give you a straight no. They say maybe. Let us know when you find somebody willing to lead. Has that been your experience, or do you want to comment on that? And if you don't, for obvious reasons, that's fine too. I know you're shy, so I don't want to ask you an uncomfortable question.
No, I mean I've been relatively outspoken about my feelings about the fundraising environment, particularly in the Triangle. And for me, it's because yes, it impacts me as a founder, but I actually get a little bit more riled up about it because I think about how, and I don't mean this to sound cocky, but my experience is like I know a lot of people in this community. I've been around. I strongly believe in what we're doing and the traction we built. And so I look and I think if I can't raise money, how can like I just feels like really hard for the people. Like I see the people who are raising money that they're on their fourth company. That's not a problem for them, right? But I see all these founders that are mid 20s, late 20s that have founder market fit. They've got the grit. We see it. They've got that early traction, and either they can't raise that capital, so they run out of steam. Because let's be honest, 99% of being successful in a startup is having money long enough to figure it out, right? We just need a little bit of time, right? You need a few iterations, but then particularly it becomes problematic in sometimes the terms that and I use the broad we are forced to take to access that capital. And
say more about that specifically. What do you mean? What kind of terms are problematic?
Evaluations and expectations, both. I think that there is an expectation here that, and again, I'm making a generalization that what people should get out of what they invest is not aligned to the rest of the country. And I hold that even in the rest of the Southeast. I think we have a more conservative nature than that. And the danger in it is, and I'll give a real example myself, is that I had, a term sheet, and um, I asked some folks about the terms, and it would have been on a safe, but I asked some people about the terms, and I was told, if you take that, you're never going to raise from a sophisticated investor again. So it wasn't just me, because I don't, it's not that I don't care about giving away ownership, but I'm not losing sleep over half a point on my equity. But what I can lose sleep over is the fact that I'm never going to raise from the best VCs in the country because I took a bad deal now. Like, I can't come back from that.
Well, what made it bad?
Valuation caps, usually, or like caps.
Well, I didn't know if there was like some multiplier or preferred
No,
status that.
more just like on the cap side for us, right? Being an early stage company, because, and I went through Techstars, so I know what it's like to take a not super great, a great terms, because a Techstars note is not necessarily the most favorable, but to be fair, they can get away with it because they're Techstars, right? And everyone just knows it's the blanket, you don't have to take it. And there's just this understanding that it's just the part of the accelerator, and it's not a big deal. But when you start to actually go out into the market and try to raise money, particularly and when you're not raising a priced round and you're now negotiating over valuation caps that do not align at all with the people I'm talking to on the other side of the country. Like, I have the terms that I was getting are sometimes a third of what my friends in the Bay Area were getting for a company with less traction and a smaller TAM. So where I'm just like, what are we even talking? Like, what am I doing here? And I know, like, 2022, like, money was flowing, and 2023 money was not. So I also understand that the environment has changed in different times. But how am I supposed to compete?
Well, let me add this data point on top of that. So yeah, we heard 2023, oh, winter is coming, stockpile, go into cash preservation mode. Yet, we do the annual survey, as you're aware of, right? And the companies we funded reported fundings that totaled about 120 million, okay, over about a 20-month period. And lest you think that was one of our like late vintage companies from like 2012 did a 50, $60 million round. It's not true. It was over 50, I think it was 51 or 53 fundings. I think the largest being like 6 or 8 million. So, great distribution. But here's the fact that, if I'm being honest, pisses me off. 70% of that funding came from outside the state.
Doesn't surprise me.
So yeah, winter's coming, but the sophisticated, funders I talked to said that's just cyclical. We say that now, we are in the business of investing our LP's money, so we're not sitting on the sideline. And so deals were getting done. And I think what's promising for North Carolina and our entrepreneurship ecosystem was that our best and brightest, like y'all, were getting funded when a lot of people weren't. But what are all these out of state funds seeing in our companies that our in state funds don't see? And I know a lot of it's alignment. And I want to be completely fair and transparent on this. We did the deep analysis, and for some of those deals that were done, the funds that funded it, that was like they only do like one or two a year. And so there was like a vertical alignment, and the company that got funded was just a perfect fit. So I'll give them that, right? But if you're still looking just for, economic opportunity and upside, which I think most of us are, at least in the funding space, it's here. And I don't blame any company that we have funded if they go out of state looking for money, because at the end of the day, your job is to get your company funded and grow and do great things with it.
Yeah, I'll go one farther and say, and maybe investors know this and maybe they don't, but, and I've heard this myself and I've said it to other people. If you walk up to a new founder, I walk up to a founder and, hey, yeah, I'm looking to fundraise. The first thing they will respond is say, or don't waste your time here. Like, that is the sentiment that this community has. If I have and I've said it too, I'll admit it. I said, don't waste your time here. But if you go up to any of the successful founders in this community, I'm not going to like put anyone on some blast. That's the comments they're going to give you. Don't even waste your time. I wasted 6 months, so much of my soul. Go out of state, get out of state as quick as you can. And there's like, it doesn't mean you have to we've got like the tweener fund and some great things that have made some contributions, but like we need to know what it is, right? Like I appreciate the tweener fund because it's a very transparent in how they transact. And that's a great opportunity. It's got North Carolina on the map. But we have all these other funds here, and it feels almost sometimes from the outside like they hold the companies in this state to a higher bar than they do companies out of state. That's even more frustrating, I think.
Oh, that's an interesting statement, right? Is it, well, I mean, there is the old expression, you can't be a sage in your own land, right? You have to go elsewhere to be exotic and to get the attention. And I would now, just not to just keep bludgeoning our own ecosystem, I would say it's probably not unique to, North Carolina and the Triangle. I mean, I remember being involved in creating funds and being invested by funds and building, encouraging funds to get involved in ecosystem work across the country during my time at the Coffin Foundation. And that would be a common refrain I would hear, to be fair, right? Like every community I've gone into, number one complaint, not enough money here. And then, number two, they're just not buying what we're putting out there. And I think that's probably a question for like anthropologists and psychologists to figure out, like, what's the psychology of funding? We've had companies move here from other states. I'm thinking of one in particular from Ohio that came down here because they couldn't get funded anymore in Ohio. They got here, they got early traction, they're $1 million ARR, and then they hit a plateau here. And now they're here going, okay, what do we have to do? Right. But it's like, okay, you've been here 3-4 years now. And it's like, oh yeah, we know you guys. Oh yeah, maybe, let us know. Because it's the South. We're very polite. I would say though, it's not, I think a bullet to the head is much more polite than, 3 to the torso. Because, your time is precious as the founder, right? There's an opportunity cost for you speaking to a fund that's never going to write you a check, in the sense that you're not talking to somebody that might.
Yep, absolutely. But I think that because I agree, I'm not surprised. And I would say that I don't think that any of this is intentional. It's just that like I feel like I definitely experienced some gender biases in my fundraising, and I also don't think those are intentional. I think that most people in this community, which is why we do have such a strong ecosystem on the support side, are very well intended. Like, but that doesn't make payroll, and that certainly doesn't accelerate a company, because who doesn't have that behavior is Silicon Valley. Who doesn't have that behavior is LA. Who doesn't have that behavior is Boston. Like these ecosystems that we thrive to be, oh, how do we move up on the list? Because we're making the list when it comes to biggest growing tech communities, like all these other startup ecosystem type of stuff, but we don't make the funding one. But I would say, like, I mean, yeah, it probably does happen in Ohio, but it's not happening in these top tier cities, and we should be comparing ourselves with the best, not the bottom.
I would agree. I don't want to be the best in a mediocre group. Frankly, I'd rather be struggling in the top group than dominating a mediocre group. And I think that is aspiration. And I'll be honest with you, to get back to the kind of the joke that we're transplants, I think that's a benefit to those of us who have come from different ecosystems, that we bring that perspective and say, there's different ways of doing this and different, models that can be considered. And it's just a question of, wearing people down over time and showing them that. But you'd mentioned gender bias. Are you implying that women aren't being funded at the same level as men?
A little bit. I mean, statistically, right, we can see how stark it is. It's, I think what it's like 2% now is the last assessment. And people like to have the same claim that they do when we talk about the wage gap, right? It was like, oh, as many women aren't putting themselves out there, women aren't building the same size of companies. To which I claim like a lot of bullshit, honestly, on that. But the one I think that is the most difficult to deal with is just the like it's quite pervasive in the way that the expectations are held of us. Um, I think that you have industries like automotive where I work, right? Where like there's a lot of gender issues. And it's very in your face. Like the misogyny is very obvious in many situations. Well, typically well-intended folks, but it's very much there. But we like to in the tech community consider ourselves to be these open-minded people, and we're fighting to see more women represented. Yet I know the questions that I'm asked are not the same as my male colleagues. And I've also been conditioned to be more conservative. Like I'm not conditioned as a female to lie about success rates and stuff like that. Like we're conditioned to be much more safe and much more honest. And I mean, people need to understand that conditioning that's already happened, but then also not continue to make it worse. I mean, I know that back when I was helping to run SOAR, the program the NCID had for female entrepreneurs, and that big tech crunch study came out, and they called it like promotion prevention questions. So men were asked promotion questions like, "What's your growth rate?" And a woman will be asked, "Well, what's your churn rate?" And this was happening over and over and over again. So if you have 10 minutes on stage at TechCrunch and you spend 10 minutes bragging about yourself versus 10 minutes defending yourself, what do you think you're going to, like, what perception are you going to walk away with?
That's profound.
And that's all I'm
That's
doing is
profound.
defending. Like, you're constantly defending yourself because everyone assumes you can't instead of everyone assuming you can. And that's the biggest, to me, challenge that we've got to get in front of.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. You gave me a little bit of a knowledge bomb there, even though what you said, we had a program suited for female founders until the community told us that it kind of ran its course. But I never even thought the subtlety of that. And if the context is when you get that big shot to be on the big stage, if there's just, bias in the questioning, you're absolutely right. It's subtle, but it's profound. That you would be, people would be like, yeah, I think, you conclude saying you're excited for the one that was all just very optimistic and it's roses and it's, huge, CAGR and things are going to be great. And the other one being like, oh man, there's a lot they're defending against. Right. And you might not even be aware that you walked away influenced that way. So thank you for that. I've heard, in amongst our Black and brown founders as well, that there's a gap. And I was recently speaking on a panel on the green economy, and one of our friends and ecosystem partners, Talib Gravesman from Knox, he said this a long time ago, and especially kind of when you're advancing Black entrepreneurship, there's a lot of coaching programs, right? Lots of coaching programs, mentoring programs, lots of well-intended people and groups want to help, but very few whipping out the checkbook. So his statement has always been, no more coaching without capital, right? You want me to get involved, get excited about a coaching opportunity, and I'll be appreciative, but there's got to be a pot of gold, at the end of this journey. And I couldn't agree more because I've seen it firsthand. So,
And not the other way either, right? Like it's both. Like it has to be both because, we talked earlier like the importance of community, and that's what this area has done so well. Is we've done such a good job at helping people. And as much as I can like, poke at like some of the challenges that we experience on the fundraising side, this is the most one helpful communities that I've ever experienced. Like this doesn't work that way in Silicon Valley. That's why I think we can be better, is because we can find that fusion. Because yeah, at the end of the day, like you need capital to build these companies. Like this does not build itself. And what ends up happening is the only people that get to build companies are the ones that can afford to do it, which has racial biases, gender biases, right? Because if I'm getting paid less my whole life and then I go out to start my own company, the wage gap has now influenced my funding gap, and it's just pervasive. I mean, again, you can say the same with, like you said, with Black and brown folks. Like you don't have that privilege to start a company, and that's not the way to build a strong economy.
no doubt, you don't even have the debt capacity. I think about my third startup. I just did it all on my personal signature because I had the debt capacity to do that. And I think the status quo just takes that for granted without being aware that others don't have the same advantage. We're kind of running out of time here. I wanted to share a little piece of trivia with you. So as I was preparing for our call, would you be surprised to know that you and I have 460 mutual connections on LinkedIn?
I think that might be my most with anyone. That's a lot.
I thought for me too, I thought that would be up there. So I poked around a little bit, and then I thought, okay, well, let me check my good pal, Gary Schoniger, because, he and I have been in the trenches together for nearly 15 years. Gary clocks in at 636. So also impressive. But one last check, and I do have one that I have to believe is the absolute top for me personally, and that is Ted Zoller at UNC. He and I share 1,101 mutual connections.
Wow, that is crazy.
How crazy is that? And that, that goes to, and he and I work together at the Kauffman Foundation, and a lot of our overlap are in international, connections and things like that. But I think, I'll take 460 with the likes of you and be proud of that. I think, again, it goes to ecosystem. And so this is the ecosysteming podcast. So let me ask you to close, with one kind of BHAG of a question. It's, let's pretend it's in your power. Trommel's went off and had a wonderful success. You've had a great exit. You have life-changing wealth now and the luxury to kind of look around and do something. Where would you put your time and talent and maybe treasure to change, to make better in the ecosystem or in any other way?
Yeah, I think to me, I mean, the hypothetical, or I guess like kind of the untangible comment I would make on that is to figure out how to create equity in funding. Like not equal funding, but actually create equity, right? Understanding the fact that, for example, Black and brown people, particularly rural areas, don't have access to the same capital that someone who just, stepped out of SAS has because their parents work there too. So I think that trying to be able to reshift that, but I really think that the way we can create this generational change is ensuring that we are building more startups that create more millionaires. And so it's also about putting people in those seats with that entrepreneurial grit. Because the best way to learn about how to run a company is to help run a company, right? That is the school of entrepreneurship does not happen inside a classroom. And if we can create equity also in those early hires, because that's also the problem, right? Oh, I want to hire someone for my startup. Well, I can only hire someone that can afford to take a crap salary. So now I'm not actually able to get it to that next person. So that millionaire doesn't become the next founder because they never could afford to. So we have this like vicious cycle. And I think that there's some abilities by some strategic capital, the right levels and the right conversations. Like I appreciate like, right, GDC exited and they made what was like 80 millionaires or something like that. Like we need more GDCs, but they aren't going to all look like that.
Yeah, no, I like that answer, obviously, especially now when such efforts seem to be under fire. Right? You look at the Fearless Fund case and other like equity-based initiatives kind of being assaulted at the moment. I think that's a fight worth fighting, and I would agree with you. As hopefully you would already know based upon our portfolio, right? I think we check every stage, and with the fall, seed, and micro cutoff for finalists and semifinalists, I think we're at like 51% female. It's half. It's half across the board. And that's pretty much the way the population breaks. So, hey, listen, with that said, I want to thank you so much for making time for us while you're up in Michigan doing exciting things for Trommel. Please come back. Maybe you and Harry can we'll do a three-way podcast here once you guys have had your big exit. Because I am certain it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when, knowing you as I do. So please remember us little folks when you're wildly successful and just incredibly famous.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Stay connected with NC Idea on LinkedIn and Facebook, and subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest as we celebrate our 20th year. Catch new episodes of Ecosysteming every other Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and being a part of this thing of ours.